She sat quietly in her wheelchair, reading. Then a millionaire's bodyguard hurled her to the airport floor, clearing space for his boss's designer luggage. 40 people watched. Not one moved, too afraid of the family's name to lift a finger. What none of them noticed was the quiet figure in the corner, or the 90-pound military working dog lying at his feet. In the next 8 seconds, this off-duty Navy SEAL would turn their world inside out and ignite a courtroom war that would reshape every life it touched. Drop a comment and tell us what country you're watching from. And if these stories stay with you, hit subscribe. Terminal 4 smelled like recycled desperation. Expensive perfume layered over burnt espresso and the stale nerves of 1,000 strangers. Most people coped by disappearing into their phones. Mason didn't have that luxury. Ignoring his surroundings had long ago stopped being something his body allowed. He'd chosen a corner seat in the boarding lounge, back pressed to a concrete pillar. Not random, instinctive. The way a man picks a position when he's spent years mapping exits and measuring threat distance before his conscious mind catches up. Active duty Navy SEAL. A body that read like a record of damage, and a mind that processed tactical information the way other people processed small talk. Lean, dense with functional muscle that coiled beneath a plain grey t-shirt like cable under canvas. A tactical cap sat low on his brow, cutting the fluorescent glare, those lights that buzzed at a frequency nobody else seemed to register. At his boots lay Atlas, 90 pounds of German Shepherd, coat the shade of toasted sable. Eyes sharp enough to make strangers look away. Atlas was no pet. Multi-purpose canine. 3 deployments. His black tactical vest read __, quote _0__ in blunt white letters. The dog's chin rested heavy on Mason's tan boot, but those ears, they never stopped, tracking every rolling suitcase, every overhead chime. Both of them were running on fumes. A high-intensity training cycle had ground them past the failure point and out the other side. Still, even exhausted, something in them stayed coiled. Relaxed readiness, a state civilians never quite understand. They were waiting on a flight back to base, a thin seam of stillness between the chaos of fieldwork and the routine of the barracks. 15 feet from Mason's pillar, a large blue sign marked the priority seating area, the International Disability symbol, a small pocket of calm in the airport's current of noise. Seated there was Arena, late 20s if he had to guess, a quiet dignity about her that didn't ask for anything. She was paralyzed from the waist down, in a lightweight wheelchair so well fitted it looked less like equipment and more like part of her. Cream-colored cardigan, a book open on her lap, eyes steady across the page. There was a stillness to her that Mason recognized. Not fragility, composure. She wore her skin like someone who'd stopped apologizing for the space she occupied. She didn't look like someone who needed saving. She looked like someone who'd already fought her own war and walked out, or rather, rolled out, carrying a different kind of armor. That quiet wouldn't hold. It broke apart, not with a scream or a crash, but with an entrance. The Sterling family didn't arrive. They colonized the space. Mr. Sterling came first, mid-50s, a suit that cost more than a decent car. His face locked into an expression of permanent, rehearsed displeasure. His wife trailed behind him, draped in silk, a designer handbag held out like a royal insignia. 2 teenage sons followed, moving with that performative boredom only the deeply privileged ever master. They were loud, their voices spread across the terminal like something invasive, swallowing the low murmur of the crowd. They moved without awareness of anyone around them, or maybe with full awareness and full indifference, expecting the world to part. ___quote __1___. Mr. Sterling's voice sliced through the lounge. I told them we needed lounge access, and now we're out here with the masses. My back is killing me. He surveyed the crowded seating area, face twisted with open contempt. His gaze settled on the priority zone. The blue sign, if he noticed it at all, meant nothing. He saw open space. He saw one woman between him and comfort. A flick of his wrist toward Arena. Over there. At least there's some room. Boys, get the bags down before somebody grabs those seats. The two sons moved without hesitation. They crossed toward Arena with a lazy indifference that sent a prickle up the back of Mason's neck. The taller one, bleached hair, designer sweatshirt, heaved an oversized leather duffel onto the empty seat beside her wheelchair. Metal buckles cracked against plastic. He never glanced at her, just turned to his brother, grinning. Quote 4. Arena lifted her eyes from her book. Calm, steady. She closed the cover, one finger holding her page, and addressed a man who appeared to be their father. Quote 5, she said, her voice clear and level. Quote 6. Mr. Sterling didn't break stride. He reached the zone and planted himself directly above her, swallowing her personal space. A full head taller, even if she'd been on her feet, and he wielded that height like a blade. 7, he said. The sweetness in his tone was thick, deliberate, more degrading than any raised voice. Arena answered, voice unwavering despite his closeness. Mrs. Sterling stepped forward now, her nose pinched as though something foul hung in the air. A vague wave toward the packed corridor. Mason watched it all from his pillar, eyes narrowing. He felt Atlas shift, the dog's muscles drawing taut, reading the tension before anyone spoke another word. Mason's hand settled on the dog's head. A silent hold, but his own pulse was climbing. He recognized this species of behavior. He'd encountered it on every continent. The conviction that one's own comfort outweighed everyone else's existence. That rules were written for lesser people. Quote 13. Arena said, and now steel threaded through her voice for the first time. Quote 14. Mr. Sterling's expression changed. The veneer of civil irritation cracked, and something far uglier surfaced beneath it. He glanced at his sons, then back at Arena. You're being very difficult, he said, pitch dropping low. And I don't like difficult people. We're staying. If you have a problem with it, call security. But I imagine they have better things to do than relocate a family because a girl in a chair wants extra elbow room. He turned his back on her. Conversation closed, by his decree. As he pivoted, his heavy leather briefcase swung wide. It caught the wheel of her chair with a dull metallic thud. Arena flinched, her hands locked around the armrests. The sons piled more bags onto the surrounding seats, walling her in. They laughed, talked about plans at their destination, carrying on as though the human being 2 feet away were nothing more than an inconvenient piece of furniture. The tension became something you could feel against your skin, a physical weight. Nearby travelers turned their faces away, afraid of what was building. Mason did not look away. He rose slowly. Atlas stood in perfect unison beside him. The predator had surfaced. Something shifted in the terminal air, a low, dangerous current, as Mr. Sterling turned his back on Arena. A gesture of pure dismissal. It landed like a blow. Arena sat motionless for one heartbeat, fingers pressing against the carbon fiber rims of her wheels. Not from fear, from something hotter. A burning injustice she'd spent years learning to carry through a world that was never designed with her in mind. Around her now, a wall of expensive leather luggage, a barricade built from vanity and entitlement. She drew a breath. Her voice came out quieter than before, but narrower, sharper, like a needle finding its mark. __quote _17___. Mr. Sterling paused mid-stride. He didn't turn right away. He released a long, theatrical sigh, the kind that made his sons smirk behind him. When he finally pivoted to face Irina, the polished mask of the accomplished businessman was gone. What remained was the twisted fury of a man who had never heard the word no from someone he considered beneath him. He didn't see a human being. He saw an error in his flawless day, a malfunction to be erased. And he didn't address Irina directly. He glanced over his shoulder toward a figure standing in the dim margins of the boarding gate, a man the general crowd hadn't registered, but who had been on Mason's radar from the moment he crossed the terminal threshold. The man's name was Miller. He stepped into the light, a mountain of flesh and bone, maybe 35, neck thick as a stump, buzz cut so severe it looked weaponized. His black tactical polo strained across a massive chest. Khaki trousers concealed heavy reinforced boots beneath. His eyes held nothing. Flat, empty of empathy. The gaze of someone paid to act, not to consider. Miller was the Sterling's private muscle, a human wall erected around their arrogance, and he moved with a heavy, deliberate stride that parted the crowded aisle without a single word. "Miller, mister," Sterling said, voice cold and dangerously low. "This lady is having some difficulty understanding the concept of sharing. She's being very disruptive. Clear the area. I want my family to have some peace before we board." Vague enough for legal cover, clear enough in intent. Miller didn't pause. He didn't ask Irina to relocate, didn't extend a hand. He simply advanced, his enormous frame swallowing the light from the terminal windows. Irina looked up at him, eyes wide, breath catching. She tried to reverse the wheelchair, but the Sterling's bags rose too high behind her, a cage of designer leather pinning her into the corner of the seating row. The passengers nearby finally understood that words were about to become something far worse. A woman gasped, pulling her child close, but didn't move forward. A man in a business suit glanced up from his laptop, frowned, and looked right back down. He chose his screen over the reality unfolding 6 feet away. Miller extended one massive, calloused hand. He didn't touch Irina. He seized the armrest of the wheelchair. His fingers buried themselves in the padding. "You heard the man," Miller said, his voice like gravel grinding under a boot heel. "You're in the way." Then came the jerk, violent, sudden. He didn't just pull the chair, he wrenched its side upward and shoved. Pure, deliberate cruelty. A demonstration of force meant to humiliate as much as displace. The physics were merciless. That lightweight, precision-balanced wheelchair was never engineered for lateral force of that magnitude. It tipped instantly. Irina released one sharp cry, cut short as her body pitched sideways. Below her waist, there was no sensation, no control, no way to brace, no legs to catch her weight. She was a passenger in her own fall. Her shoulder struck the cold, unyielding linoleum first, then the sickening thud of her hip. The wheelchair, suddenly unburdened, careened and twisted across the tile. Its wheels spun hollow in the air, a capsized insect, legs churning at nothing. Irina lay where she'd fallen, her cream cardigan twisted beneath her. The book had skidded several feet away, pages trembling under the air conditioner's breath. The sound of impact was unbearable. Not simply a body striking ground, it was the noise of someone's dignity cracking open in front of strangers. For a handful of seconds, Terminal 4 held its breath. The fluorescent hum overhead swelled to fill the void. The Sterling sons stood frozen, momentarily caught off guard, while Mrs. Sterling smoothed her silk wrap and turned her gaze elsewhere, as though a woman sprawled on the floor was merely a lapse in decorum too tedious to acknowledge. Mr. Sterling made no move toward her. He looked at Miller. A curt nod. Approval, clean and sharp. "There," Mr. Sterling said. No trace of regret in his voice. "Now we have some room. Miller, get that chair out of the aisle." Irina didn't stir. One cheek pressed flat against cold tile that reeked of industrial wax and 10,000 passing shoes. Her hair had slipped from its clip, falling across her face in loose strands. She wasn't crying, not yet. Her mind had stalled, locked in the impossible arithmetic of what had just happened. In a crowded terminal, in a modern city, in daylight. She'd been thrown away like refuse. Pain bloomed from her shoulder now, a deep, pulsing ache that whispered dislocation, or something worse. But the crowd's silence cut deeper than any fracture. 40-some people in the immediate radius stood motionless. Their faces formed a portrait gallery of cowardice, of bystander paralysis. That silence, though, it didn't hold. Something broke it from the far corner of the lounge, something that wasn't human. A low, chest-deep growl. It began in the rib cage of a predator and rolled through the air like a tremor from somewhere ancient and final. Atlas was on his feet, front paws spread wide, head dropped low, upper lip peeled back to expose teeth, trained to shred tactical-grade equipment. The fur along his spine stood in a ragged crest, and his gaze had locked onto Miller with a focus that was singular, absolute, terrifying. Mason stood beside him, but this was not the man who'd been sagging against the pillar minutes before. His posture had reorganized into something lethal. Fatigue erased. In its place, the cold, glass-clear awareness of a SEAL who had just identified a priority threat. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't swear. He moved with a silent, devastating economy, stepping over his own bag, walking toward the center of the zone. Each stride carried a promise. The temperature around him seemed to drop. Passengers who had averted their eyes now couldn't look away from the man in the grey t-shirt and the black dog at his side. Miller heard the growl. He turned. His chest swelled as he watched Mason close the distance. He cracked his knuckles slowly, a satisfied grin spreading wide. He saw a smaller man, a dog on a leash, and he assumed he remained the most dangerous presence in the room. He had no concept that the countdown on his arrogance had already reached 0. In the next 8 seconds, this terminal would learn the difference between a bully collecting a paycheck and a warrior driven by purpose. The shift from stillness to violence was not gradual. For Mason, it was binary, a molecular change in the air itself. Those 8 seconds didn't begin when he reached the Sterlings. They began the instant his boot left the linoleum beside his pillar. To the panicked witnesses in Terminal 4, Mason dissolved into a streak of grey and shadow, a professional predator gliding through a flock of startled civilians. He did not run. Running was wasteful, the habit of amateurs. He moved low instead, center of gravity flawless, closing 15 feet of distance before Miller's smirk could finish forming on his face. Miller saw the dog first. Atlas, 90 pounds of fur and coiled muscle, launched on a single unspoken command that traveled through the leash like voltage. The German shepherd did not bark. Barking was a warning, and the time for warnings had ended the moment Irina struck the floor. Atlas launched from 3 feet out, his body stretching through the air like a guided projectile. He didn't strike with teeth, not the throat, not the limbs. This was a Tier 1 military working dog, trained for non-lethal takedowns in volatile situations. Atlas drove his full body weight into the center of Miller's chest like a battering ram. The sound was dense, heavy, a sandbag slamming granite. Miller, all that gym-sculpted bulk and swagger, never had a chance to brace. Air punched out of his lungs in a strangled wheeze as the dog's momentum folded them both onto the floor. Atlas locked him down in an instant, front paws pinning shoulders, snout hovering inches from the man's wide eyes. A growl, low, continuous, almost geological, pressing Miller into the tile with raw, ancient terror. At the same moment, Mason closed the distance to Mr. Sterling. The businessman watched his hired wall of muscle crumble in a single heartbeat. Something cold and unfamiliar slid through his armor of arrogance, genuine fear. He did what cornered bullies always do, swung wild. The heavy leather briefcase arced toward Mason's skull, clumsy and desperate. Mason didn't bother to slip it. He stepped forward, into the strike. Left hand caught the forearm. Right hand found the pressure point behind the jaw. Surgical. One twist of the wrist, one shift of weight. Sterling's own force turned against him. The briefcase clattered across the floor. The patriarch spun like a top, arm wrenched behind his back in a grinding chicken wing that drove him to his knees, right beside the woman he'd just ordered thrown aside. The two Sterling sons lurched forward, then stopped. Mason glanced over his shoulder, and that glance was enough. His eyes held nothing. No anger, no heat. Just a flat, mechanical readiness that promised consequences they couldn't begin to calculate. 19 and 20 years old, private school polished, never once held accountable. They had never stood in the presence of a man who could take them apart without effort. They froze there, hands half raised, monuments to their own cowardice. The whole sequence, Mason's first step to both men flattened, lasted exactly 8 seconds. Silence flooded back into the terminal. Strange, suffocating. The only sounds were Arena's overturned wheelchair rocking against the floor and the distant chime of a boarding call from another gate. Mason held Sterling locked, his voice barely crossing the threshold of a whisper. Low, controlled, dangerous in its calm. 25, Mason said. No anger, and that absence made it devastating. This was a man stating a fact as immovable as gravity. He tightened the arm lock, just a fraction, and Sterling's whimper came out thin, choked. His face darkened to a blotchy purple against the terminal grey. Arena still lay on the ground, propped on one elbow, hair tangled, face drained of colour. But her eyes were sharp, cataloguing everything. The way Atlas held the bodyguard motionless, ears flattened, focus absolute. She noted the working dog vest, the economy of Mason's violence, precise, proportional, professional. This wasn't some bystander playing hero. This was a trained operator functioning at a level of discipline she'd only encountered in classified files. Then the silence broke apart. Heavy boots, rhythmic and urgent, metal jangling. __quote _27 __. Officer Vance, tall, rigid, all business in his dark blue airport uniform, led 3 officers into the priority zone. Hands rested on holsters, eyes swept the scene. A man forced to his knees, a bodyguard pinned beneath a dog, a woman crumpled on the floor. To fresh eyes, the picture told one story, and it was the wrong one. They hadn't seen the shove. They saw only the aftermath. A well-dressed family held down by a man who looked like he'd walked straight out of a war zone. __quote _28 __. Vance barked the order, taser drawn, and aimed square at Mason's chest. The other officers fanned out to cover the flanks, faces locked tight. Passengers nearby felt the shift. Authority had landed, and a low murmur rippled through the crowd. The Sterlings saw their moment and seized it, flipping the entire narrative in a heartbeat. "Thank God!" Mrs. Sterling screamed, her voice pitched high enough to crack crystal. She lunged toward the officers, jabbing a shaking finger at Mason. "This man is insane. He attacked us. He sicked his dog on our security guard. Look at my husband. He's going to snap his arm. Arrest him. Arrest him right now." Mr. Sterling read the opening perfectly, letting out exaggerated groans of pain. "He's out of his mind. I think he's a terrorist. Came out of nowhere. We were sitting here minding our own business, and he started screaming, throwing us around." He tilted his face up toward Officer Vance, eyes glazed with rehearsed agony. "Get that animal off my man before it kills him." Miller, still flattened beneath Atlas, didn't so much as twitch, but his voice carried just fine. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 33, underscore, underscore. A coordinated lie. A defensive wall of accusations stacked high and fast, designed to bury the truth before anyone could dig for it. The two sons piled on, voices crashing over each other in a panicked chorus. Quote, underscore, 34, underscore. Officer Vance fixed his gaze on Mason, jaw rigid. Quote 35. Mason didn't flinch. His eyes tracked the taser aimed at his heart, then the officers, then down to Arena. He could read exactly how they saw him. Tactical cap, thick build, aggressive dog. And he understood with cold clarity what came next. In the eyes of the law, right now, he was the threat. Slowly, with absolute deliberation, he released Mr. Sterling's arm, stepped back, raised both hands, palms open. Every movement as controlled as the strike that preceded it. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 36, underscore, underscore. The command was quiet, firm. The German shepherd disengaged instantly, jaws snapping one final warning before settling at Mason's left side. Still locked on the threat, but perfectly still. Military discipline restored in a single breath. Miller clawed his way upright, sucking air. Mr. Sterling stayed down a beat longer, making sure the officers got a good look at the damage. "On your knees, hands behind your head," Vance ordered. A younger officer, also named Miller, no connection to the bodyguard, stepped forward with cuffs. "Officer, wait," Arena managed, her voice fighting to cut through the Sterling's noise. But Mrs. Sterling had already pressed close to Vance, her expensive perfume thick against the tension. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 40, underscore, underscore. The cuffs snapped shut around Mason's wrists. Cold metal, familiar weight, unwelcome weight. He didn't protest, didn't attempt to explain. He understood something most people never learn. In a war of words between a man in a grey t-shirt and a family with a private attorney on speed dial, truth dies first. As they led him away, he turned back toward Arena. A flight attendant was helping her up. Her eyes held two things at once: gratitude and horror. Watching the man who'd protected her marched off like a criminal. The Sterlings had already clustered together, whispering, pointing, their faces resettling into that smooth, untouchable confidence that money buys. The battle inside the terminal was finished, but the war for Mason's freedom and Atlas's survival was only beginning. That metallic click of the handcuffs was a sound Mason knew intimately, though in his experience he'd always been the one applying them, to high-value targets in lightless corners of the world. Now the cold steel pressed into his own skin. A sharp reminder that on American soil, his particular skills weren't seen as protection. They were seen as a threat. As Officer Vance cinched the ratchets tight, the sound sliced through the hushed terminal like a single gunshot, ending the chaos and beginning the slow, bureaucratic suffocation of the truth. Mason stood rigid, eyes locked on some invisible point past the horizon. His face betrayed nothing, carved granite, even as the Sterlings launched their synchronized theater for the swelling crowd of Gawkers and uniforms. What followed through Terminal 4 was a clinic in public degradation. Not a protector being escorted, a dangerous offender. 3 armed officers flanked him at cautious distance, bodies tensed like men walking beside something volatile. The travelers surrounding them, the very same people who'd stood mute and paralyzed while Arena was shoved around, suddenly discovered their courage. They whispered. They pointed. Their faces wore that particular expression of easy moral certainty that only comes from standing safely behind a police line. Fragments of their talk reached him. Animal. Thug. Terrorist. The words hung in recycled airport air like poison. This was the first barb of his new reality, a question embedded in every witness's mind. How does a man who looks like a hero end up in handcuffs like a monster? But the real devastation waited at the terminal exit. A white animal control van sat idling there already, orange lights cycling with cold, mechanical patience. 2 handlers in heavy, bite-proof canvas approached Atlas. The German shepherd felt it coming, the separation, and released a sound Mason had heard only once before. A midnight extraction. A desert wasteland. That same low, trembling keen, a frequency of pure, marrow-deep distress. Atlas didn't lunge. Didn't bare his teeth. His training ran too deep for that, discipline fused into bone. He simply turned his amber eyes toward Mason, searching, waiting for the command that would restore order to this chaos. 44. Arena called out, her voice fracturing as she fought to wheel herself toward the van. A flight attendant stepped in front of her. Safety regulations. ____45__. Nobody listened. The handlers looped a catchpole around Atlas's neck, that heavy wire noose tightening against fur and muscle, and Mason's jaw clenched until pain radiated through his skull. They didn't see a decorated combat veteran. They saw 90 pounds of liability with teeth. They forced Atlas into a narrow, steel-reinforced kennel and slammed the door shut. That metallic bang, it was the sound of severance, a tactical amputation. Mason had felt less exposed in enemy territory than he did in that moment. While he sat in the windowless basement of the airport police station, bathed in dead fluorescent light, the Sterling family occupied a private lounge 1 floor above. Richard Sterling reclined on soft leather, ice pack on his shoulder, premium mineral water in hand. He wasn't speaking with police. He was speaking with Henderson, his lawyer, a man who'd materialized with impossible speed, briefcase loaded with case law and quiet menace. "The narrative writes itself, Richard," Henderson murmured, his voice frictionless, emptied of anything resembling conscience. Random, unprovoked attack by a man with a documented history of military violence. Your boys are traumatized. Your security guard was nearly mauled. We're not simply pressing charges, we're building the official record. Beyond the lounge doors, Officer Vance was attempting to take Arena's statement. She sat in her damaged chair, shoulder pulsing with pain she refused to name, eyes lit with something sharp and deliberate. She gave her account with surgical precision. The shove, the verbal assault, how the Sterlings had cornered her, hemmed her in. She described Mason's response as controlled, proportional force applied to an active threat. Vance listened. His pen hovered above the notepad, but his gaze kept sliding sideways, toward the private lounge where the local chief of police was, at that very moment, clasping Richard Sterling's hand. The pressure was nowhere and everywhere at once. Sterling wasn't some ordinary passenger. He bankrolled political campaigns across the city. He could dismantle a police career with one conversation. "Look, miss," Vance said, dropping his voice low. "I hear what you're saying, but we've got 4 witnesses, 2 of them minors, plus a professional security officer, all stating the man in the grey shirt made first physical contact. They say he deployed his dog as a weapon. Under the law, that qualifies as assault with a deadly instrument." "He saved my life," Irina fired back, her voice bouncing off the sterile corridor walls. "They shoved me out of my chair." If he hadn't intervened, that bodyguard would have gone further. "The footage doesn't tell a clear story," Vance said, a lie, his eyes dropping to the floor. "There's a dead zone near the priority seating. All the camera picks up clearly is the dog going after the guard, and your rescuer locking Mr. Sterling in a joint hold. Everything beyond that is your account against theirs, and their account carries serious weight around here. Violence in the skies, Navy SEAL and dangerous dog arrested after airport brawl." Mr. Thorne said. His voice was polished, unhurried, the kind of voice that had never needed volume to command a room. He paused, waited for something, a flinch, a shift, anything. Mason offered him nothing. He sat motionless as carved stone, eyes fixed on Thorne with a flat, unblinking stillness that had frozen enemy fighters mid-step in combat zones. Thorne cleared his throat. A brief flash of irritation crossed his features before that predatory smile slid back into place. Quote, _58 __. Mason spoke for the first time. His voice came out low and sandpaper dry. Thorne opened his portfolio, slid a single page across the table. Mason didn't glance at the document. "You want me to lie. You want me to stand before the world and say Irina wasn't shoved, that your clients weren't predators, that I'm some fractured man who lost control. You want me to surrender my honor in exchange for my freedom." Thorne leaned closer. The sharp bite of his cologne warred with the bleach-soaked air of the room. "Honor is an extravagant luxury, Mason, and right now you're broke. But if your own future holds no weight for you, perhaps the dog's will." He produced a second document. A red "Stay" stamp marked its header. "Your German Shepherd, Atlas, because he attacked a person and inflicted serious injury, he's been designated a Tier 4 dangerous animal. Under city ordinance, that classification triggers a mandatory euthanasia order. He's being held right now, high-security kennel at the municipal shelter. If you sign this agreement, the Sterlings will leverage their influence to reclassify the event as a training incident. The dog gets transferred to a private farm, lives out his remaining years in peace. If you refuse..." Thorne let those words hover in the air like a rope pulled taut. "If you take this to trial, that dog will be put down before the first witness ever takes the stand. We will see to it personally." The room seemed to lose all warmth. Mason's hands, flat on the table, curled slowly into fists. Knuckles went white. The threat was a precision strike, aimed at the one thing Mason still had left to lose. They weren't simply demanding a confession, they were forcing him to choose. Let them destroy his partner's spirit, or let them destroy his body. Silence filled the room for a full minute. The only sounds, the mechanical tick of the wall clock and the heavy drumbeat of Mason's own pulse. He thought about Atlas, how that dog had stayed at his side through 3 deployments, how he could sense Mason's nightmares gathering before they even broke the surface. __, quote, _66 ___. Mason said. His voice barely rose above a whisper, yet it landed with the finality of a killing blow. Underscore underscore, quote underscore, 67 underscore underscore. Thorne's smile died. What replaced it was a cold, undisguised sneer. He rose, snapping the portfolio closed, the sound sharp as a bone breaking. Very well. Have it your way, Mr. Callahan. You want to be a martyr? Fine. But understand this. By the time I'm finished, the public won't see a hero. They'll see a volatile, unstable veteran who unleashed a beast on a family. And the dog, I will personally ensure the injection happens tomorrow morning. You had your chance to save him. You chose pride instead. Thorne signaled the guard. The door opened. He walked out without a backward glance, expensive shoes striking the linoleum with cold, deliberate arrogance. Mason sat alone in the grey room. The fluorescent light hummed louder than before. His gaze settled on the empty chair where the lawyer had been. For one unguarded moment, raw agony tore through him like shrapnel. He'd refused the deal. But the price? The price was a waking nightmare he wasn't certain he could endure. He shut his eyes. Atlas's face appeared behind them, steady and trusting. And there, in the darkness of that cell, Mason made himself a promise. He wasn't merely going to fight for his own survival. He was going to dismantle the Sterling's empire of lies, brick by brick, wall by wall, until nothing remained but naked truth. He just prayed Arena was doing the same. The courtroom carried the weight of cold mahogany and institutional reckoning. Old wood and industrial disinfectant hung in the air, sliced by the sterile buzz of overhead lights. Jennifer Hartley, 20 years of trial work carved into a face like a sharpening stone, stood before the jury with the kind of practiced authority that makes defense lawyers grip their tables a little harder. She didn't regard Mason as a man who'd served his country. To her, he was evidence, something to be taken apart. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice low, rhythmic, an instrument tuned for condemnation. "This case concerns unprovoked, excessive violence committed by the defendant against unarmed civilians. No room for nuance, no space for doubt. She painted a portrait of a man trained as a weapon who'd forgotten the battlefield was behind him. His tactical expertise wasn't framed as service, it was framed as a loaded gun aimed at a family trying to enjoy their afternoon. Richard Sterling occupied the second row in a tailored suit and a medical sling that looked more expensive than any legitimate bandage had a right to. He radiated the quiet, untouchable confidence of a man who'd already purchased the day's outcome before anyone spoke a word. Beside him, Mrs. Sterling pressed a silk handkerchief to her eyes at careful intervals, her performance staged for the local reporters who'd been conveniently informed about the violent veteran. 12 ordinary citizens watched from the jury box, eyes widening as Hartley described a vicious animal that had savagely mauled a professional security guard. By anchoring every detail in injury and fear, she steered the jury's attention exactly where she needed it, toward questions about Mason's stability. No info dumps, no lengthy explanations, just emotional investment in the supposed trauma of the Sterling family. When Richard Sterling took the stand, the transformation was seamless. His voice dropped low. It trembled. He spoke of wanting to protect his sons, of the shock when this man attacked without provocation. Underscore underscore, quote underscore, 71 underscore underscore. He lied. Eyes locked on the jury foreman with manufactured sincerity. Underscore underscore, quote underscore, 72 underscore underscore. He limped faintly as he returned to his seat. No medical evidence supported that limp, but it was perfect theatre. Miller followed, testimony describing Atlas as a bloodthirsty creature trained to kill. He was careful to omit one detail. The dog hadn't even broken his skin. Mason the hero, Mason the threat. Two ideas grinding against each other in that room, generating a tension you could nearly touch. Mason's public defender, Marcus Chun, rose to cross-examine. He looked like a man trying to hold back a flood with his bare hands. Marcus was 31. His caseload was physically impossible to manage, and his idealism was buckling, quietly, steadily, under the crushing weight of the Sterling family's reach. Every attempt Mason's side made to reference the priority seating sign, or the fact that Arena had been shoved, Hartley rose with an objection. Judge Hendricks sustained nearly every one. Judge Hendricks had spent 18 years on the bench. She understood what the Sterling name meant in this county. The defense looked scattered, outmatched, pointless. Mason sat at the table with his hands locked together, his face forged into something unreadable. Lies stacked around him like bricks in a wall he couldn't climb. The afternoon's peak arrived when Hartley turned to the judge for her closing request of the session. __, quote _73, __. She paused. Her gaze drifted to the empty space beside Mason, the space where Atlas should have been sitting. Quote 74. That word, destruction, landed like a sledgehammer on stone. For the first time, Mason's composure fractured. Not a shout, not a movement, just a clenching of the jaw so severe the gallery could see it. This was no longer about his freedom. This was about the life of the only partner who had never walked away from him. Arena sat in the gallery's back row, her damaged wheelchair angled into the aisle. Her expression, nothing, blank as glass. She watched Hartley's victory lap in silence. Henderson's manufactured procedural error had kept her off the witness list, stripped her of her voice through legal architecture. But as Hartley settled into her chair, satisfied and certain, Arena's hand drifted to the small, encrypted tablet balanced on her lap. She was not simply a woman in a wheelchair. She was a woman with access to data that Sterling money could never touch. She watched Judge Hendricks prepare to adjourn. A cold, precise smile crossed her lips. The Sterlings believed they held a monopoly on power. They were about to learn that a Navy SEAL and a Pentagon analyst were the wrong people to back into a corner. The question hanging in that courtroom air: what happens when truth finally punches through a wall built with money? The atmosphere shifted the instant Marcus Chun called his final witness. Up to this moment, the prosecution had controlled the story. Violent veteran, dangerous animal. A narrative tailored to jury bias and a powerful family's interests. But as Arena guided her wheelchair toward the front of the room, something else moved with her. A stillness, cold, deliberate, that began planting doubt in every mind present. She did not resemble the victim the Sterlings had tried to erase. She looked like the architect of something approaching. Richard Sterling shifted in his seat. His confidence flickered, for the first time, as he watched the woman he had physically discarded prepare to speak. Jennifer Hartley was already standing before Arena reached the witness box. Quote 75 __. Marcus Chun did not yield. He stood with a posture that had finally discovered its backbone. His gaze locked onto the judge, sharp, unflinching. Judge Hendricks leaned forward, her eyes narrowed on Arena. Arena adjusted the microphone. Her voice carried through the wood-paneled courtroom with the clarity of a struck bell. Quote 78 __. A collective gasp swept the gallery, a revelation that seized every throat in the room. The disabled woman they'd spent days hearing about was a high-level government official. Henderson, the Sterling's lawyer, looked like he'd taken a blow to the chest. His face drained to ash. What had been a local assault case now carried the weight of federal interest. "Dr. Vance," Marcus began, his voice steady. "The prosecution has claimed that the security footage from the airport was inconclusive. Can you explain why?" "Because the airport security system is managed by a private contractor with ties to the Sterling Group." Arena's eyes locked onto Richard Sterling with an intensity that made him flinch. She pulled a small silver drive from her cardigan pocket. The courtroom went still as Marcus loaded the file. On the wall-mounted monitors, a new angle of the terminal materialized. Not the grainy, distant footage they'd seen before, crystal clear. The jury watched in total silence as Richard Sterling's voice filled the speakers, cold, mocking, telling his sons the masses didn't matter. They saw the shove. They saw Miller seize the wheelchair and hurl Arena to the floor. The sound of her body striking tile was louder, more visceral than anyone had prepared for. Something shifted behind the jurors' eyes. Then they saw Mason, a blur of calculated motion. Not rage, precision. Proportional defense executed with surgical discipline. They saw Atlas pin the bodyguard with a control that left no room for argument. The image of Mason as a trained killer dissolved. In its place, a man shielding Arena with his own body, while the Sterlings screamed lies at arriving officers. 84. Arena continued, her voice cold and professional. Before Hartley could draw breath for an objection, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open hard enough to rattle the light fixtures. Down the center aisle came a man who looked carved from granite. Dress white uniform of a Navy commander, silver oak leaves gleaming on his shoulders. Commander Silas Grant, commanding officer of SEAL Team 3. Behind him, 6 men in full-dress uniforms, ribbons and medals forming a wall of military honors that shrank the room around them. They moved with synchronized precision that commanded silence without asking for it. They didn't stop until they stood directly behind Mason, a line of unwavering solidarity. Commander Grant didn't wait to be called. He stepped to the bar, his voice deep, carrying the full weight of command. Quote _ 86 __. The atmosphere had shifted. This was no longer a trial, it was a reckoning. The Sterlings were no longer the powerful family in control. They were small, petty bullies facing the combined weight of the United States military and the testimony of a Pentagon analyst. The jury was no longer looking at Mason with suspicion. They stared at him the way people stare at a man whose own country tried to break him for doing what it trained him to do. From the witness stand, Arena gazed down at Mason. A quiet, certain smile crossed her face, the kind that says, the trap has already closed. The defense had built something no fortune could dismantle. Not a case, a story of honor. All that remained was the final strike of wood on wood. The silence after Dr. Arena Vance stepped down wasn't emptiness. It was pressure. The kind that precedes detonation. On the courtroom monitors, the image held, frozen, undeniable. Arena on the ground. The Sterling family watching with the blank detachment of spectators at a show. And Mason Callahan standing alone between violence and its target. Judge Patricia Hendricks peered down from her bench. The neutrality she'd worn like armor had cracked. Beneath it, the cold, precise fury of a woman who sits in judgment and does not appreciate being lied to. Her eyes moved to the prosecution table. Jennifer Hartley hunched over her assistants, whispering hard, her composure shattered into loose papers and darting eyes. Henderson, lead counsel for the Sterlings, sat perfectly still, a man carved from candle wax, every shade of color gone from his skin. He understood the fundamental truth of litigation. You can contest interpretation all day long. You cannot contest 4K government surveillance footage. Quote 87 __. Judge Hendricks spoke, her voice carrying a new, harder resonance. Quote 88 __. The courtroom watched Commander Silas Grant rise and move toward the witness box. His skin looked carved by wind and sun. His eyes held the accumulated gravity of 1,000 operations. He walked with the kind of discipline that made the room itself seem to straighten. He didn't glance at the attorneys, didn't acknowledge the gallery. He looked at Mason. One sharp nod passed between them, brief as a heartbeat, heavy as a decade of shared war. Grant didn't need a microphone. His voice was a low tremor you felt in the floorboards before you heard it in your ears. Chief Petty Officer Mason Callahan is not simply an operator under my command, he began, each word deliberate and weighted. He is the benchmark by which we define the word protector. 13 years he has served in the darkest corners of this world. 13 years ensuring that families like the Sterlings sleep undisturbed in their fine beds, never once learning the names of the men who guard their peace. His training is not built for aggression. It is engineered for surgical restraint. What that footage shows is not an assault. It is the most disciplined application of military training to a civilian emergency I have ever witnessed. Grant leaned forward. His palms pressed flat against the railing. The Department of the Navy conducted its own internal review of the incident at Terminal 4. Chief Callahan adhered to every protocol of engagement. He identified a vulnerable non-combatant under attack by a superior force. He neutralized that force using the absolute minimum physical intervention necessary. To prosecute this man is to dishonor the uniform he wears, and to attempt the destruction of his working dog, a canine who pulled a dozen men out of death in Marja, is a moral disgrace this office refuses to let stand. The commander's words landed like the final bolt sliding into place. Every question the prosecution had planted about Mason's character, answered, resolved, buried. Jennifer Hartley rose to her feet. For the first time in her career, her voice carried a tremor. Your Honor, regardless of the witness's credentials, the fact remains that physical injuries were sustained. Judge Hendricks didn't wait for the sentence to end. Quote 93 __. The words fell like a blade through the courtroom air. Quote 94. Her gaze swept the jury box. They were nodding together, faces carrying equal parts shame and quiet outrage. Quote 95. Judge Hendricks declared, her gavel raised high. Quote 96 __. The gavel came down, and that single crack split the courtroom like thunder, shattering every lie the Sterlings had built. No one cheered, not a single voice rose. Instead, 47 Marines and the SEAL team stood as one body. Backs straight, heads high, a silence more powerful than any applause. But justice had not finished its work. Judge Hendricks shifted her gaze to the second row. Quote 97 __. The balance of power didn't shift slowly. It collapsed in an instant. Two bailiffs, the same ones who had clamped handcuffs on Mason, now walked toward the Sterling family. Richard Sterling's mouth opened, closed, opened again, like a man drowning in air. No sound came out. His sons stood frozen, their expensive clothes suddenly looking like costumes from a game they should never have played. Miller, the bodyguard, simply dropped his head as steel clicked shut around his wrists. They were led through the side door. the same door Mason had been forced through days earlier. Their exit carried no sound but the footsteps of people who had finally been seen for what they were. 10 minutes passed. Then that side door opened once more, and a familiar rhythmic panting filled the room. Atlas, freed from his concrete cage at the shelter, burst through. He didn't bark. He flew across the polished floor, tail a blur of sable fur. He didn't stop until his front paws pressed against Mason's chest, his broad head buried in the man's neck. Mason, the same man who had faced mortar fire and shrapnel without flinching, dropped to his knees. He pulled the dog into a crushing hold, eyes shut tight, feeling that steady, familiar heartbeat against his own. Irina watched from her chair. Tears ran down her face as the warrior and his dog became whole again. When Mason and Irina finally made their way toward the courthouse doors, a sea of dress uniforms waited on the steps outside. The sun hung low, casting long golden light across the stone pillars. Commander Grant and the SEAL team had formed a corridor of honor. Mason pushed Irina's wheelchair through the center. Every man in uniform raised his hand, slow, deliberate, to his brow. They weren't saluting a chief petty officer. They were saluting the woman who had used her mind to save one of their brothers. Mason stopped at the bottom step. He looked up at the sky, the cold weight he'd carried for weeks, finally lifting. He looked down at Irina. She reached up and squeezed his hand. "Where to now, Chief?" she asked, a soft smile breaking through. Mason glanced at Atlas, sitting tall and proud at his side, then back at the woman who had changed everything. "Home," he said, voice steady, clear. "We're going home." They moved forward together, leaving the darkness of that courtroom behind, stepping toward a future where honor was no longer a weapon used against them, but a shield. The story of Mason, Irina, and Atlas carries a quiet, unshakable truth. Real strength has nothing to do with the size of a bank account or the volume of a voice. It lives in the willingness to stand for those who cannot stand alone. In a world where money and influence try to rewrite what actually happened, honor, integrity, and the bond between a soldier and his loyal dog will always burn brighter than the darkest lie. Privilege may try to silence the innocent, but the courage of righteous people will eventually crack every wall corruption builds. If this story stirred something in your heart, if it reminded you what sacrifice and justice truly mean, please share it with someone you love. Leave a comment below and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and quiet strength. May God bless you and those closest to you with peace, steady strength, and the bravery to always do what is right. Type Amen in the comments if you believe truth will always prevail. Thank you for being here today. Sometimes the quietest kind of bravery reshapes an entire life. Hold on to that. Walk gently, walk strong, and we'll meet again soon.